Good morrow, lords and ladies. I bid thee welcome once again. We're back for part two of our section here on the medieval church. When we left off last time, a practice called lay investiture had begun to lead to huge amounts of corruption within the church. Today, we're going to see how the church deals with lay investiture, deals with that corruption, and then we're going to see the Catholic Church become much more political and engage in some very non-church-like activities. That's how we'll define it at this point in time. Let's get specific, though. Folks, church reform, we're going to look specifically at what the Catholic Church did to try to end lay investiture, to try to end the lay investiture crisis. And does it really work? Does it solve the problems of corruption? Then again, we'll get more into the political angle of things. We're going to look at three items that are of great importance for the church during this time period: heresy, excommunication, and the Inquisition. We'll look at heresy. What is heresy, first of all, and then why does heresy increase as scandal and corruption mounts within the church? We'll also talk about excommunication. What is excommunication? Why is this a powerful tool for the church, and how is it used against heretics? How does the church use it religiously, but also as a political tool? Because this thing is going to be a political baseball bat that the church and the Pope are going to use against folks in Europe. And then finally, the Inquisition. What is the Inquisition, and how is the church using this, ostensibly anyway, to combat heresy? Those are the essential questions. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Okay, lay investiture. Let's start there. Now, if you remember from last time, lay investiture was the practice of non-religious leaders, political guys, picking high-ranking members of the church, people like powerful nobles or kings, appointing people like bishops or cardinals. So political leaders choosing high-ranking members of the church. And when this happened, these political leaders are often choosing their friends or their relatives. They're picking people that they know are going to be their political allies. And so the folks who are becoming the highest-ranking members of the church aren't there because of their belief, their spirituality, their devotion, their desire to shepherd the souls of the faithful unto salvation. No, instead they are there because of their wealth and their status in society. It's very much a political move and not a religious one. And so, of course, because these guys are not the most qualified for their position, they're not taking their religious duties very seriously, and many of them are more concerned with wealth and power and are becoming more and more greedy. This greed, of course, leads to corruption, and that's where we were yesterday. And lay investiture is creating more and more corruption, more and more scandal, more and more political problems. And this being the case, many of the very sincere Christians in Europe begin to call for reform within the church. The church is not what it's supposed to be. They don't like it, and they want to see change. And so as a result, in 1059 AD, a church council was convened. And church councils were not unusual. A church council meeting is just where all the bigwigs of the Roman Catholic Church get together and have a meeting. The Pope, the cardinals, the bishops, the archbishops, they all get together and they address some kind of question. And in this particular case, the question is lay investiture. And at this particular church council meeting that was convened to tackle lay investiture, it was declared that political leaders would no longer have the ability to choose the Pope. Because if we remember, political leaders were going so far as to choose the Pope even. And instead of the Pope, or excuse me, instead of political leaders being able to choose the Pope or other high-ranking church officials, all these choices would come from within the church. In particular, the Pope would be chosen by the cardinals. Now, the cardinals are sort of like the number two guys in the church. The Pope is the top dog, and right below the Pope are these guys called the cardinals. And as it were, from this particular church council, it was determined that only the cardinals would be able to choose the new Pope. So when it was time to pick a new Pope, the cardinals would elect from among themselves the next person to be the Pope. This church council also determined that it would only be the Pope, and no one else, not lords, not kings, not anybody else, who could appoint bishops and other high-ranking people within the church. So they're trying to address lay investiture by basically determining that only the church can choose those who become its high-ranking officials. The action is intended to end lay investiture. Now, does it really end lay investiture? Well, I'd be a liar if I said yes. Does it take a huge bite out of the problem? Absolutely. But, you're still going to see political influence playing a big role in who gets what positions in the church. But this does go a long way to quell the problem, but it's certainly not fixing what had become a deeply rooted, institutionalized issue of corruption within the church. Now, again, like I just said, despite the reforms of this church council in 1059, you're still getting corruption. You're still getting scandal that is prevalent within the church. And as this happens, more and more people began to openly criticize the church. I mean, as they see problems and corruption within the church, people begin to call it out more and more and more. And as people began to criticize the church, they not only criticize the church, but they even begin to question or deny some of its teachings, because if the church is this corrupt, how can you be certain that what they're telling you is truth? And under church doctrine, the definition of someone who is denying basic church teachings is someone called a heretic. They're committing what is called heresy. And in other words, what they're doing is they're challenging the teachings of the church. So a heretic, or one committing heresy, is simply challenging the teachings of the church. And really, heresy could be anything. Heresy could be anything. If you disagree with a particular religious policy of the Pope, you could be branded a heretic. If you don't think that the bishop or the church or whoever is interpreting the Bible properly, you could be considered a heretic. If you openly criticize that bishop or that pope, you could be considered a heretic. If you, my goodness, decided to try to read and interpret the Bible yourself, you could be considered a heretic, because under church doctrine, only church officials were allowed to read and interpret the Bible. So there's a lot of things that could make you a heretic. So challenging the teachings of the church would brand you as a heretic. And incidences of heresy increased as corruption became more and more common in the church, which makes perfect sense, because as the church is more corrupt, people criticize them more, thus you get more instances of heresy. And so with heresy becoming a bigger problem, another church council later on down the road lays down some very strict rules to try to stop the spread of heresy. And at first, the Catholic Church tries to convert heretics, tries to bring them back into the fold, convince them that the church is right and they are wrong, and just kind of bring them back into line with what the church believes. And if that doesn't work, though, that's when the kid gloves come off and the heavy lumber comes out. If this fails, then the church begins to threaten heretics with excommunication. Excommunication is an extremely powerful tool that the Pope and the Church can wield against heretics, or really anybody who is the Church's enemy. You see, to be excommunicated means that you're basically expelled from the Church. You're kicked out of the Church. And if you're kicked out of the Church, that means that you can't take part in the Holy Sacraments. And if we remember correctly from our last session, we learned that the Catholic Church taught that the only way to achieve salvation, that is, the only way to get to heaven, is to take part in the sacraments. Thus, if you are expelled from the church and can't take part in the sacraments, then you can't achieve salvation. You can't get to heaven. And we have to remember that people are deeply religious during this time period. And even if you disagree with the actions of the Pope, or you disagree with the actions of the bishop, you still believed deeply. And you still believed that you needed to do the sacraments to get to heaven. Even if you didn't agree with the people who were administering them, you still believed that you needed to do them to get to heaven. And so if you get excommunicated, you get kicked out of the church, and you can't take part in the sacraments, you really, truly believed that you were getting yourself locked out of heaven, and that you were getting yourself in a situation where your immortal soul would face eternal damnation and never get to heaven if you were excommunicated. So this is a really scary prospect, and thus a very powerful tool for the church. And excommunication itself, that threat does not entirely get rid of heresy. People still continue to criticize the church. And in 1232, Pope Gregory IX takes this one step further, and he sets up a special court that was designed to specifically seek out and punish suspected heretics. Now, on the surface, it sounds like a good idea, because the Pope says, look, man, throughout Europe, we're having heretics locally hunted down and punished without a trial. And so he says, we're creating this court for the purpose of giving heretics a, quote, fair trial to ensure that the innocents are not getting punished. But in reality, this court, this inquisition that is being created, is under the direct control of the church. It's under direct control of the papacy. Thus, the seeking out and punishing of heretics now comes to be under the direct control of the Pope. So on the one hand, he's making it sound like a good idea, and on the other hand, it's taking the punishment of heretics and excommunication and everything that goes with it and putting it directly into the hands of the Pope. And so these courts were created to find heretics and to punish them. And if you were accused of heresy, you would be brought before the court of the Inquisition. And it's not like courts as we know them, where you're innocent until proven guilty and you get a jury trial and you get to present evidence on your behalf. That's kind of not the way it works. In this particular case, it's guilty. If you're accused, they assume you are guilty. And all they want to hear from you is you admitting your guilt. Okay, if you are accused of heresy, they want you to confess, and then they want you to beg for forgiveness. And if all goes according to plan, then I suppose you might be able to get out of it in some way, shape, or form. But more often than not, when people were accused of heresy, there wasn't really a lot of evidence to prove it, because you see, this is now becoming, as we mentioned earlier, a big political tool that people are going to use. I mean, what better way to get at your enemies than to accuse them of heresy? If you have someone who's a political thorn in your side and you want to get rid of them, accuse them of heresy. Or if you're a political figure and there's someone whose land and money that you want, accuse them of heresy. Or perhaps your neighbor's dog is constantly taking a dump on your lawn. What better way to get back at them than to accuse them of heresy? And so, honestly, a lot of times when people were accused of heresy, there wasn't a lot of proof behind it. There wasn't sufficient evidence to prove your heresy. And so the only way you could find them guilty, or the only way you could really be able to punish them, was if they admitted to heresy, if they confessed it. And people who are innocent are not likely to come in and just say, yeah, okay, I'm a heretic. So in order to obtain confessions from these people, the church would use some very unchurch-like methods. And more specifically, that would be torture. So yes, ladies and gentlemen, the Roman Catholic Church, the church, is condoning and using torture to get people to admit to being heretics. And I don't want to say that they were all innocent, but it's probably pretty safe to say that a good chunk of them were innocent, and torture was simply used to get them to confess. And there were any manner of ways. You would be amazed the number of creative ways the church could use to get you to confess to stuff. For example, over here on the right, that's a pretty common method. That's just called the wheel. They tie somebody to this wheel by arms and legs, and they might stoke a fire under your feet, and they could turn the wheel and burn different parts of your body. Or there might be water underneath it, and they would dunk you underwater. Pretty standard practice. Or you can always just chain someone by their arms from the ceiling and do Lord knows what to them. Oh, the rack and rope. This is a really popular one that's going to be used throughout much of the medieval period. I don't think it needs much explanation. You can kind of tell there. Oh, the Inquisition chair, the Iron Maiden, the chair obviously on the left, the maiden there on the right. I think by looking at them, you can figure out how they were used. Again, no explanation really required. And in many cases, when threatened with torture, people would go ahead and confess, and then in some cases they tortured you anyway. And those who did confess, theoretically would be welcomed back into the church. If you confessed and you repented and you asked for forgiveness, you could be welcomed back into the church. Not without a price, though, not without punishment, of course, as oftentimes the punishment for heresy would be imprisonment, and then you'd have to very conveniently forfeit wealth or land. Again, works pretty well if you're, a king or a noble or even the church that wants somebody's money or land. And those who did not repent, however, you would be imprisoned, and the punishment of execution came through burning at the stake. So yes, in order to cleanse heretics, you had to burn them alive. Oh, and then afterwards you take their land and their money as well. And so what we see now is that the Pope, already spiritually very powerful as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, has become politically even more powerful through the punishment of excommunication, which is directly controlled by the Pope, and through the court of the Inquisition, which is directly controlled by the Pope. He now has not just great religious influence, but even greater political influence in Western Europe. And the political hammer that the church can wield becomes even stronger, and they're going to use it during this time period. Well, that's going to do it for us for this session here, guys. We saw the church try to end lay investiture through some changes made in the church council. Only the cardinals could choose the pope. Only the pope could choose high-ranking church officials. But we saw that didn't fix the problem, because heresy, people who criticized the church and challenged its teachings, continued. We see how the church would use excommunication to deal with heretics, and then, of course, the creation of the court of the Inquisition to use against heretics, and how the church, yes, the church, would use brutal physical torture to get people to confess to disagreeing with it, to confess to being heretics. Well, those are the essential questions. Make sure that you study them and be ready to talk about them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.